Rashid Ahmed Usmani, who who went on to become first Sheikhul Islam of Pakistan. So, Sushant sir, my small question to you, that when we see casual communalism, and not going into the history part of it, but the subnationalism. Now we have talked about Pakistan and cricket and how they speak. Let's speak of the subnationalism part which exists, and one cannot deny it. And one has seen that there are Muslim leaders of political leaders, and including people, those who support them, they would support cause of Palestine, despite the fact that India is now in good terms with Israel, compared to earlier, whatever happened due to politics. And देन उसको अमली जामा पहना देते हैं कि भाई ह्यूमैनिटी की वजह से हम पैलेस्टीन को सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं। भाई कॉन्गो को नहीं करते, रवांडा को नहीं करते, सियरा लियोन को नहीं करते, बट पैलेस्टीन को सपोर्ट करते हैं। एंड वेरी इंटरेस्टिंगली, ये जो कॉन्सेप्ट है उम्मा को सपोर्ट करने का, इसका एक स्ट्रेंज एक्सेप्शन है। वो है दैट इंडियन मुस्लिम लीडर्स डू नॉट अटर अ सिंगल वर्ड अगेंस्ट दी उइगुर मुस्लिम्स ऑफ चाइना। उसके अगेंस्ट वहां पर जो हो रहा है, उसमें दे टो अ डिफरेंट लाइन, एंड आई वोंट से समथिंग अकिन टू पाकिस्तान, बट इंसिडेंटली इट लुक्स लाइक दैट। सो सुशांत सर, ओवर टू यू।
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, loud and clear.
Okay, so a couple of things. Look, one, that hypocrisy is very clear. It's not just about Uyghurs. It's, have you ever heard when the Pakistanis talk about human rights and stuff like that? Have you ever heard them talk about the human rights of Kurds, whom their favorite friends, the Turks, massacre? Have you ever heard them say anything about the genocide in Armenia? You'll never hear them say anything of that sort. So even on Palestine, their interest is purely hypocritical, and it, of course, it comes from the Islamic identity, and many of the people, especially in our part of the world, don't know that in the Palestinian territories, it's not just the Muslims, Muslim Arabs, but also Christian Arabs who are against Israel. Uh, Same in the case of Lebanon and many of these places. So that is one part of it. The other part of it is, when you talk about what happened in 1947, that the same guy who was holding aloft the flag of Muslim League and talking about two nation theory and talking about Pakistan and shouting the slogans, especially in UP and CP, or the current Madhya Pradesh, or Bihar and these places, कि हंस के लिया है पाकिस्तान, लड़ के लेंगे हिंदुस्तान, और लड़ के लिया है पाकिस्तान, हंस के लेंगे हिंदुस्तान, stuff like that. Uh, the very next day after partition, they all made a beeline to Congress. It's like Navjot Singh Sidhu, who was a loyal member of the BJP for I don't know how many years, and then one fine day he decided that he's switching sides, and today he's become secular and he's become anti-fascist and he's become all those things. Sanjay Nirupam, die-hard loyalist of the Shiv Sena, and then suddenly got whitewashed the day he joined the Congress. And so it was with these Muslim Leaguers. The day they joined the Congress party, they were whitewashed and they became Indian nationalists, so as to speak. But were they? I'm not so sure. Does that mean that, and I completely agree with Anand, does that mean that, you can generalize that Muslims by and large are not loyal? I don't agree with that, not at all. Far from it. I think there will be certain issues on which they will not agree with you and me, but on a range of other issues, you will see them, take up cudgels on behalf of the motherland. So I think those generalizations are extremely problematic, and I don't necessarily subscribe to them. Secondly, I don't think we should get into this thing that if you don't support a particular political party, that means you're not loyal to the country. I think that is also something which is extremely problematic, and that needs to be avoided. But does that mean that you should not call out people, who actually practice casual communalism? Should you not call out the people, who actually spout venom, Furfura Sharif, and I can, there's no point actually naming people, but we all know what I'm talking about. So I think we need to get away from these binaries, which we tend to do. It makes analysis easy, but I don't think it's the correct way to analyze things. The next point I wanted to make is about, uh, you know, uh, uh, I think I also see, and feel free to push back and correct me if I'm wrong on this. But Islamic societies around the world, I think you need to start distinguishing how their general attitude towards life. For example, in large parts of the Arab world, let's talk about Syria, for example. Before this ISIS phenomena came in, Syria was a wonderful place. It was a beautiful place, liberated completely. Yes, it had an authoritarian regime, uh, but I don't think any of these countries allow the kind of nonsense which goes on in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, or for that matter in India. uh, the Turks, before this fellow Erdogan took over, and Erdogan also came in because of certain reasons, not necessarily because the Turks just went totally ballistic on Islam. And there is still a very large secular population inside Turkey. Uh, Iraq, for that matter, under Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein might have been a scoundrel, but Saddam Hussein was very secular in his outlook. Iran, for that matter, before the mullahs took over, and even today, if you look at the Iranian society, large parts of it are very conservative, no doubt about it, and very very orthodox in their outlook. But there are also substantial portions of the population which are very very cosmopolitan and do not believe in what I think the correct word would be the Dakyanusi way of looking at the religion. Look at in the Arab world, look at a country like the UAE. Look at the kind of enlightenment they have shown in their policies. Yes, it's taken them time. Yes, they've evolved over a period of time. But so I think uh, I make a distinction between, and I think the best thing which I have read, and again, feel free to counter me on this, uh, are the two books on his travels in Islamic world by V.S. Naipaul, and his description of, for example, Pakistan, which he starts by calling it a criminal enterprise. Uh, I think is the most apt description I've ever heard. And then when he talks about, the kind of a schizophrenia of the neo convert, uh, I think he pretty much hits the nail on the head. And if you look at the way the Pakistanis show their obsession with Islam, and you compare it with the more relaxed kind of an approach which many of the other Muslim countries have on Islam and on people who are not Muslim, you will see the difference, which is why you will see many of the countries in the Islamic world actually look down upon the Pakistanis, and actually try and restrict their entry into their countries because of the kind of poison these buggers will bring with them. uh, so you see those trends as well. So I think we need to start distinguishing between that. And I sense very often, I sense in all the kind of, you can call it casual or you can call it blatant communalism by the Pakistanis, whether it's on the cricket field, whether it's in television studios, whether it's in political speeches, you name it. Uh, in a country which is 97% Muslim, in a country which has completely cleansed itself of its minorities and is relentlessly doing it. Uh, just today, there's a report of a 13-year-old girl who's again been kidnapped and forcibly converted. 13-year-old. Can you imagine? Uh, but that's what these brutes do. Uh, and there is no outcry, there's no outrage on that, except for a few fringe elements. But I also sense a kind of a deep seated insecurity in these guys. So, for example, that schizophrenia is is shown up when they, they're talking to themselves. They say stuff like, "Oh, हम तो राजे होते हैं." राजे होते हैं का क्या मतलब है कि हम राजपूत हैं? अब भैया, या तो आप मुसलमान हो या आप राजपूत हो। how do you keep your primordial identification intact and yet turn Muslim, and then you shun everything about that primordial identity? How does that work? Does that not make you culturally and socially schizophrenic? I think it does. It's very clearly does. It's the same with the Jats in Pakistan, and many of the other convert communities out there. In fact, almost 90 to 95% of them are converts, and then they some of them go to the extent that when they are getting married within the communities, they want that their family chart should be prepared on the basis of a Hindu Pandit who will certify that they were originally Rajputs who converted, and they were not some riffraff who then took on a Rajput identity. So, can you imagine the ridiculousness of that? So, I sense that there is this very clear schizophrenia which I see in these characters. The other thing which I see is that there is not even a pretension to show that there are other communities which might be living in Pakistan, or that you need to have respect for other communities. A few years back, there was a survey in Pakistan. Again, I don't think you will see such a survey in any other country, or a survey result, where they were asked, "What is your primary identity?" You ask people in India, and I can bet my backside that when you ask somebody in India, "What is your primary identity?" he'll say, "I'm an Indian" first. Then he might say, "I'm a Maharashtrian" or something else, and probably the religious part would come number three, if not number four. Perhaps some maybe caste might come even above religion. I don't know. That is pure speculation. But in Pakistan, this survey came up with, I think the figure was over 70% or something like that. It was a ridiculous figure of people saying that their first identity is as a Muslim, not as a Pakistani, not as a Punjabi, not as whatever biradari they belong to. Uh, so I think that tells you a lot about uh, the kind of successful indoctrination, if I might use the word, which has been done in Pakistan. But related to that is this thing that when you identify yourself as that, then this casual communalism comes pouring out. So you will openly, things like what we've just heard, and many people probably have heard it for the first time. This clown Sheikh Rashid saying that it's the victory of Islam, a cricket match, or Waqar Yunus, or any of these other fellows who were into conversions of their teammates to Islam or make them better Muslims. All these characters, uh, they don't even think that there is something not quite correct in what they are saying. It just comes pouring out. Or in television channels, they'll say, कि भाई हम सारे के सारे मुसलमान हैं यहाँ को, stuff like that. It comes pouring out, and that kind of casual communalism uh, is reflected in virtually everything that these guys do. So in the light of that, for people like Harbhajan Singh and others to say कि यार हम तो एक ही लोग हैं, या maybe we were one people 75 years back, we aren't the same people anymore. There's a lot of difference which has come in, and I think it is I would say it is certainly a kind of insecurity among people in India when they, talk to a Pakistani and say, "Oh, Vakar bhai या Akram bhai या Wasim bhai." यार तुम अपने यहाँ पर तो किसी को भाई नहीं बोलते, वो तुम्हारे भाई कैसे हो गए यार? Call him Wasim or call him Vakar or call him whatever Imran or whatever the bugger's name is. Why do you need to add the appellation of bhai next to it? Do you say that same thing out here? So, it also reflects a kind of a, I don't know, insecurity, if you will, inferiority, if you will, among people in India. हम तो एक ही हैं, हम तो भाई भाई हैं, हम तो एक ही लोग थे, हमारा तो एक ही कल्चर है। वो बोलते हैं भाई हमारा कल्चर है ही नहीं आपके साथ, तो आप क्यों बोलते हैं कि भाई हमारा कल्चर एक है? Why? For what? Treat them as a separate people, yeah. And maybe you will be able to deal with them the way they need to be dealt with, rather than carry this baggage of nostalgia, this baggage of, history, and whatever else you want to call it. Why do you want to, carry on with that baggage? And for those who think that, before the 1940s it was all very hunky dory in that part of, or in this part of the world, that's utter nonsense. People lived separate lives even then. Yes, they interacted, but they lived separate lives. So I think we need to, but we've also been indoctrinated over the last 75 years with the kind of leftist nonsense which has been fed down our throats. We don't know our own history. We don't want to know our own history. We are scared of our own history. We are terrified of it because we feel that if people come to know what the history truly was, uh, what the unspeakable crimes happened, then those might happen again. But my point is that you should know those things, not because you want to avenge them, certainly not. Far from it. You should know those things so that you can guard against those things happening ever again in the future, which is what the Israelis do, which is what the Jews do. And perhaps that is something which we need to learn from them, that you never forget what happened to you. That does not mean that you do something similar to your adversaries and your enemies, but you make sure that that does not happen ever again to you. So I'll just end out here.
Thank
Yeah, can
Yes,
I
sir.
just
Yes, sir.
quickly make a small intervention?
Yeah, Anand, sir, please.
Okay, just
This is
I've
Kanchan
just
here.
dug out a quote of Ambedkar. Sorry, Kanchan, I didn't. Can I
Okay,
just complete?
sorry. Yeah, Anand, sir, you complete actually. Sorry, Kanchanda. Actually, I was confused between the voices. Anand, sir, please.
All right, thanks. I'll be very brief. Just a comment on what Sushant said, and then on the point that I was asked to make a comment on allegiance and Darul Islam. I've dug out some excellent quotes of Ambedkar, so I'd like people to know those. But very briefly on what Sushant said, may I humbly disagree a little bit on the earlier thesis of Sushant, where he said that there are Muslim regimes that are, he took the example of Syria, he took the example of Iraq, he took the example of, I think, some other country as well. And he was making a distinction between those Islamic countries and Pakistan. I disagree there, Sushant, because in science, or specifically in chemistry, there is this term we use which is called the global energy minimum. That is where, after all a molecule does, roaming around here and there, creating all sorts of havoc, it comes and settles down there like a nice little puppy, to the global energy minimum. For Muslim countries, for Muslims, the global energy minimum is the Quran. It takes just a flick of a switch from them to turn into this so-called progressive, ultra-modern society where Muslim women are wearing bikinis on the beach like Iran was, into the regime that Iran became in the late 1970s. And that switch is, you hark back and you go back to Quran, because the problem there is, and that is the hypocrisy, where I blame the bad Muslims, that they are reading the same book, they are cushioning the extremists, and they know within themselves that at any point of time their society will flick a switch, and before you know it, it will turn to fundamentalism, and they won't be able to do anything because they cannot condemn what has been written in detail and meticulously and specifically. Let me take the example of even Pakistan. Before Ziaul Haq, came in, it was largely very progressive. I mean, you don't see the shades of Pakistan you see now, ultra fundamentalist, in the 70s, mid 70s at all. And the point is, the flick of the switch happened when Ziaul Haq brought in the Hudud ordinances. And the Hudud ordinances were the punishments he prescribes according to Allah. Now, the extremists loved it. He gained popularity. But the moderates couldn't do anything, because what could they say? They say, I mean, after all, Allah had commanded those punishments. So the moment they say, I don't accept that, they are basically denying what is written by Allah, in what is prescribed or ordered by Allah in Quran. So any Muslim society, and that is what actually although Sushant was right about Naipaul, Naipaul also, said that you know, the often, used cliche that is, a convert is more Catholic than the Pope. And this is what Naipaul also have, that all the Islamic countries that have become Islamic because of conversions, they are practicing, a much more ritualistic, much more, based on the holy book, that kind of Quran, and you cannot go back on that. Same thing is happening to Turkey. You have Ataturk, who was, resolute, authoritarian, even resolute in making Turkey a secular state. And look what has happened now. I mean, I can see Turkey 30 years from now, it would be Pakistan. And to take an example of Afghanistan before Taliban, or after Taliban were driven out in the last 17, 18 years, you know about the Pew survey. 99% of Afghans who were not under the Taliban rule, or under the so-called progressive rule, still wanted Sharia. So as long as you have the global energy minimum in the holy book, where everything, politics to the way you should lead your life, everything is meticulously dictated and ordered, you cannot deviate from that. You can deviate for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, but ultimately you will be forced to come back to it. Now,
So,
just a minute.
so can I push back?
Yeah, sure.
So, Anand, have you finished? Or
I just wanted to make the second point. I wanted to
please
quote Ambedkar, Sushant. That will only
go
take
ahead. Go
2
ahead.
seconds. Can I do that?
Please go ahead.
Sure. Let me quote Ambedkar, because that question was asked of me. And so this is, I'm just quoting Ambedkar right now. On the allegiance of Muslim to his motherland, this is what I was asked. Ambedkar is writing, I quote him, among the tenets, one that calls for notice is the tenet of Islam, which says that in a country which is not under Muslim rule, wherever there is a conflict between Muslim law and the law of the land, the former must prevail over the latter. And a Muslim will be justified in obeying the Muslim law and defying the law of the land, unquote. Then Ambedkar quotes the following: the only allegiance a Muslim, whether civilian or soldier, whether living under a Muslim or under a non Muslim administration, is commanded by the Quran to acknowledge is his allegiance to God, to his Prophet, and to those in authority from among the Muslims. Then Ambedkar says, I quote him, this must make anyone wishing for a stable government very apprehensive. But this is nothing to the Muslim tenets, which prescribe when a country is motherland to the Muslim and when it is not. According to the Muslim canon law, the world is divided into two groups: Darul Islam, abode of Islam, and Darul Harb, abode of war. A country is Darul Islam when it is ruled by Muslims. A country is Darul Harb when Muslims only reside in it but are not rulers of it. That being the canon law of the Muslims, India cannot be the common motherland of the Hindus and the Muslims. It can be the land of the Muslims, but it cannot be the land of the Hindus and the Muslims living as equals. Unquote. So I hope that answers the question that you asked earlier about what Ambedkar thought of the allegiance of Muslims. Yeah, Sushant,
Yeah,
please carry on.
just
Okay. So
can I just come in, please?
Dada, it just two very quick points.
No, I can leave. I mean, because it's a one-way discussion over here.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there is a great obsession with the Quran, and sometimes I wonder whether we are more obsessed with the Quran than the average Muslim is. For the average Muslim, the concerns of the day are the same as the average Hindu or the average Christian, either in India or anywhere else in the world. I don't think every Muslim lives by canon law, or just like every Christian does not live by biblical law. So sometimes I think we get too obsessed with what the Quran says, and just because Ambedkar gave his view, that does not have to become the overriding view, or that does not have to become the gospel truth. Now, Somebody mentioned over here that there was great support for Pakistan among the non-landowning classes, the non-zamindar classes, the non-Nawabi classes. I mean, that is only understandable. I mean, the peasant who worked on the lands of a Nawab or a Zamindar who was backing the Muslim League or Pakistan, he would endorse it. That's only to be expected. But finally, who left for Pakistan? The Muhajirs. They were never accepted by Pakistan as a part of their society or of their nation. The MQM remains a dissident force over there, unhappy, disgruntled. If you look at East Pakistan, the Bihari Muslims went there. The Bengali Muslims of Bengal did not go there. Or the Urdu speaking Muslims of Bengal, they went there. The Bengali speaking peasantry of Bengal didn't go to East Pakistan. So to sort of broad brush it, that everybody wanted it, but some stayed back and then they changed tune. No, that is not true. The second point is this whole thing about how modernist Arab states were. Now, Egypt is often cited as a great example of a secular Arab state which then fell into Islamism. That's balderdash. Egypt gave birth to the two men who are the fathers of Islamism. One is Hassan al-Banna, and the second is Sayyid Qutb. And today, the Islamist interpretation of Islam, the radical interpretation of Islam, owes itself to these two men. And to gloss over these facts, added to it, is that why do we always consider that a Western way of life is a modernist way of life? I mean, I know of Muslims who are perfectly at ease being in India. They are perfectly at ease saying that I'm an Indian first, but they reject the Western concept of modernization, like Anand referred, I think Anand mentioned wearing bikinis. And I know of more Hindus who would reject that. They would think that it is a wrong way of wrong lifestyle. It's that is not modernism. And if a Hindu rejects it, we don't take note of it. But if a Muslim rejects it, we say, see, it is because of what the Quran tells the Muslim. Uh, this whole thing of uh, constantly quoting Ambedkar to justify the bleakest view of the Muslim not being able to integrate himself into mainstream India. I think that is, I mean, we are trying to project what we think, but we can't say it directly, so we are using Ambedkar to say it. Now look at it this way. Tagore, who was a landowning zamindar, he writes in his memoirs that during one of his visits to his zamindari, somebody came up to him with a complaint. He was a Muslim peasant over there and referred to him as Nabi. Now, that was something which came impulsively. Of course, things have changed. Of course, the way I mean, we have we when Sushant gave the example of General Zia. Now, why is it that there are an equal number of studies which show that Islamism becomes an instrument for the oppressed? Look at the people in Pakistan who are which section of society in Pakistan has sort of benefited financially, economically, and what are the sections that have not? It's easy to prey on them. And that would be equally true for all the Arab countries. Muhammad Atta, who led the people who flew planes into the Twin Towers, he came from a ghetto in Egypt. His family may not have been badly off, but they are the kind of people who were to always and still continue to be treated as shit over there by the ruling elite. Nobody gives a damn about them, and that is how they respond. The Arab palace and the Arab street have been two different ideas, and the Arab palace has always used Islam to keep the Arab street in check. And that is what General Zia did. Saudi Arabia led this whole idea that you can use Islam to keep your people in thraldom. But from there to extrapolate that every Muslim treats the Quran as the final word. I mean, deep within he or she may, but it's not necessary that each one of them lives by Quranic injunction. If you go to the Darul Ulum website, the fatwas which come over there, that it is haram to take out life insurance or any insurance. Are we then suggesting that no Muslim has life insurance in this country? I distinctly remember once running a series of articles just copy pasting those fatwas. I mean, how can we even remotely think that the majority of Muslims would be living by those fatwas? That it is you cannot use perfume. It is haram to use perfume. You must dye your beard with mehendi. How many Muslims have you seen who actually do that? So let us not lump them all together. Yes, we have a problem. We have a problem of radical Islam. We have a problem of radicalization. And I am not at all remotely suggesting that all these Sarjil Imam type of characters are the deprived. They are a part of the elite. My bloody tax money goes into feeding people like that, keeping them in clover. But there has to be a nuanced approach. People have to understand that there is stuff happening, and that churn cannot be met politically alone. There has to be social intervention. Hindu community leaders have to get involved. There has to be reach out at individual levels. There has to be reach out at community levels. And yes, but that does not even remotely mean that you should give up where you stand. I am very clear in my mind that it is outrageous that in Delhi, the capital of this country, a Hindu household is threatened by Muslim neighbors that you can't do puja because by ringing the bell and blowing the conch, you are disturbing us. That is where state intervention is called for. So why isn't the state intervening? Why isn't the law enforcement authority intervening? I live in Uttar Pradesh, and I have seen how it is possible. Uttar Pradesh has changed in the last almost 5 years now. It has to happen at various levels, and it has to happen in a manner that takes a nuanced approach. You cannot blackball every Muslim in this country. That would be absolutely uncalled for. That would be wrong. And to say that every Muslim believes that the Quran is above all, I mean, probably he or she does, but they're not practicing it. They're not out in the streets saying that, no, I don't accept Indian law. The best example is the Supreme Court judgment on Ayodhya. How much bloodshed did we see over that? And how much bloodshed did we see before the judgment came? So my simple suggestion is Let's take a nuanced view, let's take a graded view, and let's not lump everyone together. And please, I think it's high time we stop quoting Ambedkar on everything, because Ambedkar is fast becoming like Gandhiji. I mean, from bank customer relations to how we should deport ourselves while bathing. There is a Gandhi quote for every occasion. So
Can I?
yeah, thank you.